The last thing Commander Vathari Ossel expected, on the worst day of her military career, was to be outranked by someone who wasn't even supposed to be in the battle. He wasn't a commander. He wasn't even attached to her unit. He was a human, one of those strange, soft-skinned creatures from the third arm of the Orion Spur, and he had absolutely no business being on Kellrath Station when the Volkai swept in from the dark side of the debris field and turned the whole eastern docking ring into fire and silence. But he was there, and he stayed, and I was there too, which is why I can tell you this story, because I watched it happen, every moment of it. And I've been carrying it around inside me ever since, like a stone that won't dissolve, like something I need to say out loud before it becomes one of those memories that gets buried under everything else that followed. So let me tell you about the day Commander Vathari Ossel gave the order to fall back. And let me tell you about the human who didn't. My name is Rithak Voss. I'm a field correspondent, or I was back then. I documented combat operations for the Conclave Intelligence Archive, which sounds impressive until you understand what it actually means. It means I followed soldiers into bad situations with a recorder in my hand and a deep, irrational belief that somehow the act of witnessing would protect me. It doesn't. I know that now, but in those years before Kellrath, I'd been in enough firefights to get comfortable with the sound of rail pulse fire, the particular smell of a burning atmospheric processor, the way soldiers' voices go flat and quiet when things are about to get worse. I knew those sounds. I knew that language. What I didn't know, what none of us really understood yet, was humans. This was early in the integration period. The Terran Compact had been formally recognized by the Galactic Conclave only 18 months before. Humans had been assigned to joint operations in a handful of border sectors, mostly as observers, liaison officers, that sort of thing. The understanding, the polite, careful, diplomatic understanding, was that humanity was still being evaluated, still being assessed. They were new, they were enthusiastic, they were, frankly, a little alarming in some ways that the Conclave hadn't quite figured out how to categorize. I'd met a few humans before Kellrath, mostly at diplomatic functions. They talked too fast and laughed at things that weren't funny and stood too close and made eye contact for longer than was comfortable. They brought food to share without being asked. One of them had tried to pat my shoulder at a briefing in Sector 7, which, I'm a Drethaki, we have sensory filaments along our upper ridges. Shoulder contact is extremely intimate, and the human had been mortified when I explained this, had apologized 17 times, had clearly been replaying the moment in his head for the rest of the meeting. But I understood even then that their intentions were kind. They were just new to all of this, new to us. New to how big the galaxy was and how many different ways there were to be alive in it. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Dallin was not new to combat, though. I didn't know that when I first saw him, standing in the corridor outside the Eastern Operations Bay on Kellrath Station, holding a ration pack and watching the tactical display with the particular stillness of someone who's already done the math and doesn't like the answer. He was medium height for a human, which made him slightly shorter than most of the Vathari and Drethaki personnel on station. He had dark skin, close-cropped hair, and the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, it feels occupied. Like he was always thinking about something just slightly behind his eyes that he wasn't going to tell you about unless you earned it. I noticed him because he was the only human on the operations floor that shift. And I noticed him because when the proximity alert went off, that horrible three-tone shriek that means something very bad is very close, he didn't flinch. Everyone else did, including me. He just looked at the display, set down his ration pack, and said quietly to no one in particular, "That's a Volkai formation sweep. They're not probing. They're coming all the way in." And then the first impacts hit the outer hull, and everything started screaming at once. Let me tell you about Kellrath Station because it matters. It sat at the confluence of 3 hyperspace corridors in the Brennar Expanse, a mid-tier logistics hub that processed roughly 40% of the supply chain for conclave operations in that entire sector. Not glamorous, Not famous, but critically important in the way that unglamorous things often are. If you wanted to strangle the Conclave's military capacity in the Outer Brennar, you cut Kellrath first. The Volcae knew this. They'd known it for 2 years, apparently, because we found the planning documents later, after everything was over, and their intelligence on Kellrath's rotation schedules, defensive gaps, and supply cycles was meticulous. Disturbingly meticulous. They hit us during a shift change, which is the oldest trick in the book, and it worked anyway because that's what the oldest tricks do. The outer defense platforms were running at 60% because 3 of them were mid-maintenance cycle. The fighter wing that was supposed to cover the eastern approach was 4 hours out on a logistics escort run. And the garrison, Commander Vathari Ossel's garrison, was at roughly 70% strength because the other 30% was on rotating rest cycle after a brutal 2-week patrol operation that had gone 20 hours over schedule. When the Volcae dropped out of the debris field, they'd been using the gravitational shadow of the asteroid belt to mask their approach, something they'd apparently practiced extensively. They came in fast and they came in coordinated. 47 ships. Attack class, most of them, with 4 heavy cruisers anchoring the formation. Kellrath Station had 11 defensive emplacements, a garrison of about 800 soldiers, and whatever fighter cover happened to be docked at the time, which that day was a single wing of 12 Conclave interceptors. 12 versus 47. 800 against, we later estimated, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 Volcae assault troops. Commander Vathari Ossel had been in command of Kellrath for 3 years. She was V3 tall, pale-plated, with the long secondary arms her species used for close-quarters combat folded tight against her upper thorax the way they always were when she was concentrating. She was not, by any measure I can apply, a coward. She'd fought in the Brennar skirmishes. She had commendations going back 15 years. Her troops trusted her completely, which is the kind of trust you can't manufacture. You either have it or you don't. When the Volcae hit the outer ring and the tactical picture crystallized into something irreversible and terrible, she looked at it for exactly 40 seconds. I counted. I was standing 8 meters behind her when she did it, recorder running, watching her process the math. 40 seconds. And then she made the only call she could make, which was the hardest call anyone in that room had ever heard given. All units, this is Ossel. Initiate fallback protocol Vega. Immediate evacuation. Priority sequence. Medical, technical staff, command corps. Fighting withdrawal to secondary position at Kellrath Beta. All units confirm. The confirmations came in. One by one. The organized, trained, disciplined confirmations of soldiers who trusted their commander even when what she was saying was "we are leaving." There was no panic. There was just grief, I think. The particular grief of soldiers who understand exactly what they're being ordered to do and exactly what it costs. And then a voice came in on the open channel, not a unit confirmation, just a voice, calm and direct, from someone down in the eastern docking ring and said, "Commander Ossel, I'm reading pilot Thessara Ven in Bay 14. She's alive. Her fighter took a direct hit on landing, she's pinned, she can't move, and her bay is compromised." What's the evac plan for her? Vathari closed her eyes, because she already knew there wasn't one. Bay 14 was on the wrong side of the Volcae approach vector. To reach it, you had to go through 3 corridors that were already under active assault. The evacuation routes had been calculated without it, not because anyone wanted to leave Thessara Ven, but because the alternative was losing the evacuation teams trying to reach someone who might already be too badly injured to survive the journey anyway. Bay 14 is outside the safe corridor, Vathari said, and her voice was very steady. All units hold fallback protocol Vega. We do not deviate. A pause, then the voice again. Understood, Commander. I'll handle Bay 14. And that was Marcus Dallin, I know that now. In the moment, I didn't know who it was. I was watching Vathari's face, watching the way her jaw tightened, watching her absorb the implications of what she just heard. "Who is that?" she said very quietly. "Get me an ID on that transmission." Someone at a console pulled it up. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Dallin, ma'am. Terran Compact Liaison, assigned to Logistics Coordination. He was on the operations floor 20 minutes ago. Vathari turned to look at the display that showed the eastern sector. The corridors between the operations floor and Bay 14 were lighting up red. Volkai breach indicators, active combat, the kind of terrain that swallows people whole. Dallin, she said, opening a direct channel. Stand down, that is a direct order. The fallback sequence is active and you are to proceed to the evacuation assembly point. A pause, static, then, Commander. Thessara Ven is one of yours. She brought her bird home because she didn't want to eject over the debris field and leave it floating. That's why she's pinned. She landed when she should have punched out because she didn't want to lose the fighter. She made that choice to protect the wing's asset. Dallin, not leaving her in there. And then his channel went quiet but not off. Just quiet. Like he was moving and didn't want to talk while he was doing it. Vathari stared at the display for a long time. And I kept my recorder running, because that was my job, and because some part of me already understood that I was witnessing something I would be trying to explain for the rest of my life. I need to stop here and tell you something about the Volkai. Because if you don't understand what Marcus Dallin was walking into, you won't understand what kind of person it takes to walk into it. The Volkai there's not a clean word for them in most languages. They're not monsters. That's too easy and it's not accurate. They're a species with a culture built around dominance hierarchy and resource acquisition through force, which sounds like a description of about half the species in the galaxy, until you understand the specifics. The specifics are that they're fast. Faster than they look, which is already fast. They're bilaterally symmetric but with 4 functional limbs instead of 2, all of which are used for locomotion and combat interchangeably. They communicate during operations through subsonic pulse patterns that most other species can't hear, which means they coordinate without language you can intercept. Their armor is organic composite, grown rather than manufactured, which means it interfaces with their nervous system and has a partial sensory function. They feel what it feels. And their assault doctrine in a situation like Kellrath was to move fast, hit hard, take the command structure first, and let the resulting confusion do most of the killing for them. The corridors Marcus was moving through had Volkai assault teams in them. Active assault teams, not in formation, in sweep mode, which is different. Formation is predictable, sweep is not. They move in pairs and triads, covering angles, and they don't stop for injured or surrendered enemies, because their doctrine doesn't recognize the concept of surrender as a legitimate battlefield status. This is the environment Marcus Dallin walked into, with, as we later established from the recovered footage, Kellrath had internal sensors that partially survived, a standard-issue conclave sidearm, a maintenance access card, and whatever was in his pockets. He had no armor. He had no long-arm weapon. He had no tactical support. What he had was, and I'm going to use the exact phrase that showed up in the official report later, because someone in the debrief room had the presence of mind to write it down. What he had was an apparent operational familiarity with the station's maintenance infrastructure that significantly exceeded his assignment parameters, which is a very formal way of saying. He knew every maintenance shaft, ventilation bypass, and emergency access panel on that station. And we have no idea how or when he learned it, but he did. Bay 14 was 847 meters from the operations floor in straight-line terms. In the actual geometry of Kellrath Station, with its concentric ring structure and the eastern sector already partially compromised, it was more like 2 kilometers of usable path. And that was before you factored in the Volkai. Marcus Dallin covered it in 11 minutes. We know this because the internal sensors logged his access card pings. He was using the maintenance shafts, bypassing the main corridors entirely, moving through the service infrastructure of the station the way someone moves through a space they've memorized in the dark. Later, watching the recovered footage, I could see him moving, crouched, fast, completely silent, through conduit tunnels barely wide enough for his shoulders, through utility crawl spaces between decks, through a ventilation routing junction that put him 40 meters past the main Volcae breach point without ever crossing their path. He came out in a maintenance access hatch inside Bay 14 itself. The bay was a wreck. The blast damage from whatever had hit Thessara Ven's interceptor on landing had torn the starboard wall open. There was raw vacuum exposure, partially sealed by emergency bulkhead panels that had deployed but not fully seated, which meant the bay was losing atmosphere slowly but continuously. The interceptor itself was a mess of sheared metal and crumpled hull plating. It had come down wrong rolled, and the cockpit section was trapped under a collapsed section of ceiling strut that the initial impact had shaken loose. Thessara Ven was in the cockpit. Thessara was V3, like Ossel, same species, same pale plating, same secondary arms. But she was younger, much younger. 17 months out of the academy, which in V3 terms means she was something like 22, 23 years old in human equivalent. She'd made it back to the station with her fighter critically damaged because, as Marcus had said on the channel, she hadn't wanted to punch out over the debris field. She'd wanted to save the fighter. She'd saved it, in the sense that it was technically present in Bay 14 and had not been lost in space. But the landing had done what damaged hardware does when you push it past its limits, and now Thessara was pinned under 200 kilograms of collapsed ceiling strut with a fractured thoracic plate, a ruptured secondary arm, and a slow internal pressure bleed that the cockpit's emergency med system was currently fighting a losing battle against. She was conscious when Marcus got there. Barely but conscious. He pulled himself out of the maintenance hatch, scanned the bay, assessed the atmosphere bleed, looked at the collapsed strut, and then went to the cockpit and pressed his face against the cracked canopy so she could see him. She looked back at him. Her eyes, V3, have 4 optical organs, wide-set and compound, were clouded with pain and whatever the med system was pushing into her bloodstream. Human, she said. The cockpit's internal comm was still functional. Her voice was thready but clear. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you, Marcus said. But here we both are. This is the part I want you to understand. Because there's a version of this story where Marcus shows up, says something inspiring, and everything goes smoothly. This is not that version. The strut was too heavy to lift alone. The med system in Thessara's cockpit was buying time, but not much of it. The internal bleed was serious, and she needed actual medical intervention, not an automated stabilizer. The bay was losing atmosphere, and the Volcae had, by this point, secured the eastern docking corridor and were beginning systematic sweeps of the adjacent bays. Marcus had 11 minutes before they reached Bay 14. He started talking to Thessara, and he started working, and both of those things happened at the same time, which I've come to think is the most human thing about him. Tell me your name, he said. Not because he didn't know it, he'd pulled her up on the tactical display, he'd heard Ossel's channel, but because he needed her conscious and focused, and giving someone your name is a small act that pulls you back into your own body. Thessara Ven, she said. Pilot First Wing, Kellrath Station. Marcus Dallin. I do logistics. He was examining the collapsed strut, running his hands along it, feeling for stress points, looking at the angle of collapse. Do you have structural specs for this bay in your cockpit system? Why? Because I'm trying to figure out how this strut is mounted and where its balance point is. If I can shift the collapse angle, you can't lift it. I'm not going to lift it. I'm going to pivot it. He looked up at her through the canopy. I need about 6 centimeters of clearance on your port side. 6 centimeters, you can get your secondary arm free, and with that free you can help push while I pivot. Between the two of us, my secondary arm is ruptured. How much function? A pause, she tried to flex it. Made a sound that even through the cockpit comm conveyed very clearly how much that hurt. Maybe 40%, she said. Maybe. 40% is enough if I do the heavy part. He was moving to a maintenance cabinet on the wall now, pulling it open, assessing what was inside. I need a pry bar, a bracing wedge, and something to anchor against. The cabinet's got, he sorted through it. Yes, okay, give me 4 minutes. The Volcae, I know. He didn't look up from what he was doing. I've been counting. We have about 9 minutes before the nearest patrol hits this bay. which means I need 4 minutes to rig the pivot, 2 minutes to execute, and 3 minutes to get you out through the maintenance shaft before they breach the door." Thessara was quiet for a moment. "That's a very tight margin," she said. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I know. Can you hold on for 9 minutes?" Another pause. Then quietly, "I can try." "'Kay." He pulled the pry bar free, tested its weight, moved back to the strut. "Then let's get you out of there." Back on the operations floor, the evacuation was proceeding. Vathari Ossel was managing the fallback with the precise, controlled competence of someone who has practiced for this exact scenario and doesn't let themselves think about what it costs, because if they think about what it costs, they'll stop. The wounded were moving. The technical teams were moving. The command corps was moving. The fighting withdrawal, her soldiers buying time against the Volkai assault, giving the evacuation convoys the seconds they needed, was grinding and brutal and expensive in ways that would haunt everyone who survived it. She kept the direct channel to Marcus open the whole time. She didn't say anything on it. But she kept it open. I know this because I was watching the command console display, and his channel tag was pinned in the upper right corner of her tactical overlay. Whenever a status update came in from the evacuation units, her eyes would flick to that corner for a fraction of a second before returning to the main display. She was listening for him, even while she was managing everything else. She was listening for him to come back on channel and either say we're out or say something she didn't want to hear. At the 8-minute mark, 8 minutes after Marcus had gone quiet, the senior comms officer at her console said, very carefully, "Commander. Bay 14's internal sensors just went offline." Vathari didn't respond. "That could mean the Bay lost power in the assault damage," the officer continued. "Or it could mean—" "I know what it could mean," Vathari said. "Silence. Continue the evacuation," she said. The pivot took 4.5 minutes, not 4, because the first bracing wedge position Marcus chose wasn't going to hold the weight, and he had to reposition it, which meant he had to move it while the pry bar was already engaged, which nearly got the whole thing away from him. There's a moment in the recovered footage, grainy and partial as it is, where you can see the strut shift in a direction it wasn't supposed to, and Marcus throws his whole body weight against the pry bar to arrest the movement. And the sound he makes is the particular sound of someone who is pushing past what the human body is designed to do and is doing it anyway because there is no alternative. He held it, repositioned the wedge, braced, took a breath. "Thessara," he said. "On my count, 3, 2, 1, he pivoted. The strut moved 6 centimeters to port. 7, 8, settled against its new load-bearing point with a sound like a very tired thing finding somewhere to rest. Thessara's secondary arm came free. She made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, relief and pain folded together. The particular vocalization of someone who has been compressed and suddenly isn't. And Marcus was already at the cockpit manual release, working the emergency canopy lever, pulling it toward him with both arms while she pushed from inside with her good secondary arm, and whatever she had left of the ruptured one. The canopy released. Thessara then pulled herself free of the cockpit with a combination of her own effort, Marcus's hands under her arms hauling her upright, and what I can only describe as pure absolute refusal to stop when stopping would have been so easy. She was upright. Damaged, bleeding, upright. Marcus put her arm over his shoulder. "Maintenance hatch," he said. 20 meters, directly behind you. "Can you move?" She moved. They had 2 minutes left when they reached the hatch. I know this because the sensor log from the adjacent bay, which did still have power, recorded the Volkai patrol's access of the Bay 14 corridor door at 11 minutes and 42 seconds after Marcus had first entered the bay. They were in the maintenance shaft when that door opened. The Volkai entered Bay 14 and found nothing except a wrecked interceptor and a displaced ceiling strut that had been very precisely pivoted 40 centimeters from its original position. The maintenance shafts, moving with an injured pilot, were a different problem. Thessara Ven was functional. She was not even close in good shape. The thoracic fracture meant every movement through the crawlspace was agony. She didn't complain about except in the involuntary sounds her body made when she put pressure on the wrong angle. The ruptured secondary arm was tucked against her body, but it was still there, still a weight she was dragging, still a liability in the cramped geometry of the service infrastructure. Marcus was navigating by memory, and by the faint indicator lights that ran along the shaft junctions, maintenance way markers, meant for technicians who needed to orient themselves in the dark of the service tunnels. He'd been through this route once already inbound, but inbound he'd been alone and moving fast. Now he was moving at Thessara's pace, which was slower, and he was also carrying most of her weight on his right side, which changed his center of gravity, which meant the crawlspace geometry he'd memorized was slightly wrong in practice. He adapted. That's the word. He adapted, which means he was wrong and he fixed it and he kept moving and he didn't make a production of it. They were moving through the service infrastructure of a station under active assault. The Volkai's breaches were generating vibration through the superstructure, deep, rhythmic impacts, the kind that travel through metal and make your chest feel wrong, like your heartbeat is slightly out of sync with itself. Sections of the station's power grid were failing and restoring in cycling patterns, which meant the indicator lights were doing strange things, flickering, going dark for 10, 15 seconds at a time, coming back on. "Stop when the lights go," Marcus said. "Keep moving. Use me as your reference." "I can't see anything when they go out," Thessara said. "Put your good hand on my shoulder and follow." "I've got this path." In the dark, and I mean real dark, the total darkness of a metal tunnel deep in a station's superstructure, Thessara then put her hand on Marcus Dallin's shoulder and trusted a human she'd met 4 minutes ago to carry her through something she couldn't see. And he did. The evacuation assembly point was at Kellrath Beta, a secondary installation about 40 minutes transit from the main station, connected by a covered transfer corridor that doubled as an emergency escape route. It wasn't designed for full station evacuation, but it had the docking capacity to receive the emergency transports and enough atmosphere and structural integrity to hold several hundred people until the Conclave rapid response could arrive. Vathari had gotten approximately 600 of her 800 garrison to the assembly point when Marcus Dallin's channel crackled back to life. "Commander Ossel, this is Dallin. I have pilot Ven. We're in maintenance tunnel J7, approximately 300 meters from the secondary evacuation hatch in the transfer corridor. We need someone to open that hatch from the corridor side. It's sealed on a 6-digit code and I don't have it." The operations floor, what was left of it, the mobile command element that had packed up and relocated to the transfer corridor, went very quiet. Vathari's hand was on her comm before anyone else had processed what they'd heard. "Dallin, this is Ossel. Say again." "I have pilot Ven. She's mobile, injured but stable. I heard you." Her voice was doing something complicated. "Kellrath, get me the secondary hatch code for J7 junction. Now." Someone scrambled. 30 seconds, 60 seconds. "Ma'am," a young technician, voice tight. "Secondary hatch J7. Code is 449721. Vathari opened the channel. Gave him the code. 40 seconds later, a hatch in the transfer corridor opened from the inside, and Marcus Dallin stepped through it with Thessara Ven leaning against his right side, her good hand still on his shoulder, her feet moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who will absolutely not allow themselves to stop. The soldiers in the transfer corridor, the ones close enough to see it happen, didn't cheer. It wasn't a cheering moment. It was quieter than that. It was the quiet of people who had been carrying something heavy and have just felt it get slightly lighter. I was there. I was in the transfer corridor, recorder running, because I'd moved with the command element. I watched Marcus Dallin bring Thessara Ven through that hatch, and I watched Vathari Ossel cross the corridor in 6 long strides and stand in front of them and look at both of them and not say anything for several seconds. Then she looked at Marcus specifically. "You disobeyed a direct order," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. He was out of breath. He hadn't been out of breath in the tunnels. He'd been conserving it for the movement. Now standing still, his body was catching up on everything he'd been asking it not to feel. You put yourself in direct contact with active Volkai assault teams. I used the maintenance shafts. I avoided direct contact. The shafts are not rated for combat use. No, ma'am. Vathari looked at him for a long moment. Her secondary arms, the ones folded against her thorax, were doing something subtle and complex that I later learned was a V3 expression of controlled emotion. Something between gratitude and something she didn't have a direct translation for. Get Pilot Ven to medical, she said, to both of them, but specifically to her own soldiers. Then she looked back at Marcus. And you're with me until we're off this station. Is that understood? Understood, Marcus said, and I caught it. On the recorder, the way the corner of his mouth moved barely, just barely, when she said you're with me, like he'd been waiting to hear it. Not because he needed the validation, but because being included, being counted in, was something that still surprised him enough to register. They got out. Most of them. The transfer corridor was compromised 17 minutes after the last evacuation element crossed it. The Volkai found it earlier than the models had predicted, which is exactly the kind of thing that happens in real combat as opposed to planned combat. But 17 minutes was enough. The math worked, barely. Kellrath Station fell. It was retaken 11 days later by a conclave rapid response force that hit the Volkai occupation so hard that the political repercussions are still echoing in some sectors even now. The strategic importance of the station made the counteroffensive a certainty. Vathari had known that when she gave the fallback order. The station could be retaken. The people in it could not be replaced. She'd made the right call. I believe that. Most people who study Kellrath believe that, but Thessara Ven was on a medical transport 4 hours after walking through that hatch, and she made a full recovery, partial they said at first, but she proved them wrong. She always proved them wrong. She was that kind of person, and she flew again, 14 months later in the same sector in a better fighter. And that doesn't happen if Marcus Dallin follows his orders. There's a part of this story that I keep coming back to. It's not the part in the bay, though that's the part that makes it into the official records and the historical summaries. It's not the part in the maintenance shafts, though that's the part I think about when I can't sleep. It's the part in the transfer corridor, right after they came through the hatch. I was close enough to hear it. I was probably too close, recording equipment and all, but nobody was paying attention to me, and I was very quiet about it. After Vathari gave her instructions and her soldiers took Thessara toward the medical station, and after Vathari had turned to deal with the 17 other things that needed her attention, Marcus Dallin stood in the transfer corridor for a moment. Just stood there. He was bleeding from somewhere. There was blood on his left sleeve, just below the elbow, which I hadn't seen before and which he apparently hadn't noticed or had noticed and decided didn't matter. His uniform was torn at the shoulder. His face was, I don't know how to describe it exactly, not blank, not triumphant, just present, the face of someone who is very specifically in the moment they're in and not anywhere else. A young Drethaki soldier, maybe 18 or 19, standing nearby said something to him, quietly so I almost didn't catch it. Why did you go? You were ordered not to. Why did you go? Marcus looked at him for a second. Because she was there, he said. The soldier blinked. That's not a strategic. No, Marcus agreed. It's not. And then he moved off toward wherever Vathari had indicated he should be, and the young soldier stood there looking like someone had said something in a language he understood perfectly and still couldn't quite translate. I know that feeling. I've been carrying it since Kellrath. Part 2. What the VORRKAI didn't plan for. Let me tell you what the official after-action report said about Marcus Dallin. It said, Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus R. Dallin, Terran Compact Liaison, demonstrated exceptional initiative under combat conditions. Recovery of pilot Thessara Ven, 1st Wing, Kellrath Station from compromised Bay 14 represents a significant deviation from ordered fallback protocol. However, given successful outcome, no disciplinary action is recommended. Cross-species commendation referral submitted to Terran Compact Liaison Office. That's it. 2 sentences and a referral. The humans, When the report got back to the Terran Compact, apparently had a different reaction. I've heard versions of this secondhand, but the consensus seems to be that they were simultaneously proud and unsurprised, which tells you something about what they already knew about their own people that we were still learning. Marcus Dallin, for his part, did not seem particularly interested in the commendation. I interviewed him 3 weeks after Kellrath, in a medical facility on the station Orville Prime, where both he and Thessara were recovering. Him from the things he'd done in the maintenance shafts that his body had finally sent the bill for, her from the surgery that had done what the cockpit med system had been buying time for. He was sitting in a chair by the window when I came in, looking at the star field outside with the same expression he'd had in the transfer corridor, present. Not anywhere else. The correspondent, he said when he saw me. Yes, Rithak Voss Conclave Intelligence Archive. I know, I've seen your work, you were on Kellrath. Yes, he nodded. You were there the whole time, from the first alert. I was on the operations floor when you came on channel. He was quiet for a moment. What did she look like? When she gave the fallback order, he meant Vathari, not Thessara. He knew what Thessara had looked like because he'd been there. He meant Commander Ossel, who he'd only spoken to through a comm channel. Like someone doing the hardest thing she'd ever done, I said. Correctly, he nodded again. Like that was the answer he'd expected or maybe hoped for. She was right, he said. The order was right. I need you to understand that I know that. She made the right call with the information she had and the situation she was managing. She saved 600 people. And yet, I said, he looked at me. And yet Thessara was in Bay 14. A pause. That's all it was. It wasn't philosophy. It wasn't insubordination as a principle. She was there and I could reach her and he stopped, started again. In my experience, when you look at a situation and you say there's nothing we can do, the question you always have to ask is whether you've checked everywhere, whether you've actually looked at all the routes, whether the thing that looks impossible actually is, or whether it just looks that way from the angle you're standing at. And Bay 14 wasn't impossible. It was hard. There's a difference. I want to talk about what happened in the weeks after Kellrath, because the story doesn't end in the transfer corridor. Thessara then woke up from her second surgery on day 4 of her recovery. I know this because I was still at Orville Prime. I decided this was the story I needed to stay with, the one I wasn't going to let become a data entry and a filed report and a forgotten thing. She woke up, and the first thing she asked about was her fighter. The attending physician, a Vrethali, very experienced, very patient, explained to her that her fighter had been destroyed when the Volkai fully breached Bay 14 approximately 4 minutes after she and Marcus had left through the maintenance hatch. Thessara received this information. Then she asked about Marcus. They told her he was in recovery, 2 floors up. From a ruptured muscle group in his left arm, the sleeve I'd noticed, and 3 cracked bones in his right hand that he apparently hadn't mentioned to anyone until the medical check-in at Orville Prime, at which point the physician had given him a look that Marcus had described to me as a very specific kind of medical disapproval. Thessara asked if she could see him. They said not yet. She asked again 3 hours later. They said soon. She asked a 3rd time the next morning, at which point someone in the medical administration apparently decided that facilitating this was going to be less disruptive than continuing to say no, and Marcus was brought down in a wheelchair, not because he couldn't walk, but because the physician had taken one look at him trying to walk and deployed the particular authority that medical professionals have in that specific situation. And Thessara was sitting up in her bed, very carefully, her thoracic brace doing the work her fractured plate couldn't yet. I was not in the room for this meeting. This I want to be clear about. I have not invented this or dramatized it from whole cloth. What I'm telling you now comes from both of them, from things they said in separate interviews, which aligned closely enough that I believe them. Marcus came in, sat in the wheelchair next to her bed. She looked at him for a while with those 4 compound eyes in the way V3 look at things they're trying to understand completely. You should have left me, she said. Probably, he said. The commander ordered you to leave. She did. And you didn't? No, Thessara was quiet then. My fighter is gone. I heard, I'm sorry. It was my fault. I should have ejected. A pause. I didn't want to leave it. It seemed important to bring it home. I know, Marcus said. You told me in the bay. She blinked all four eyes, the V3 equivalent of a slow blink, which carries a specific meaning in their emotional language that humans don't have a precise parallel for. Something in the territory of I see you seeing me. Why did you tell me your name? She asked. When you came to the cockpit. Why did you ask me mine? Because you needed to be present, he said. It's easy to go away inside yourself when you're hurt and scared and trapped. Names pull you back. Human technique, human instinct, he said. Or my instinct, I don't know how universal it is. Thessara was quiet again, then she said, Marcus Dallin, logistics. That's me. I don't understand you, she said. It was not an accusation. It was the honest statement of someone who has encountered something they cannot fully map and is being direct about it. Your species. You were not required to be on Kellrath. You were liaison observer. The battle was not your responsibility. No, he agreed, but you stayed. Yes. And you went into those corridors. Yes. Why? I need to understand the why. Not the logistics of it, I understand how. I understand the maintenance shafts, I understand the pivot, I understand you knew the station infrastructure. What I cannot understand is the why. What is the calculation that produces that decision? Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at his right hand, the one with the cracked bones, currently wrapped. I don't think it was a calculation, he said. I think it was simpler than that. You were there. I could move. The thing between those two facts was, he paused. In my head, it was just a problem. How do you get from this point to that point? What are the available paths? What are the obstacles and how do you navigate around them? I don't, he stopped again. I don't think I was being brave. I think I was just solving a problem. A specific problem. I needed to get you out of that bay and I had 11 minutes and that was the whole world. Thessara looked at him for a long time. Among my people, she said, when someone saves your life there is a word. Verathsal, it means approximately you have taken my debt. The one who saves is owed something specific, permanent, and deep. It is not metaphor, it is structural obligation. He heard of that, Marcus said. I'm not V3. You don't owe me. I know you're not V3, she said. I know our customs don't bind you. I'm not telling you this because I expect you to understand the full weight of it. A pause. I'm telling you because I want you to know that in my people's language, in the oldest part of our language, there is a word for exactly what you did. And I intend to use it, whether you understand it or not. Marcus was quiet. Thank you, he said, which was, she told me later, exactly the right response. Even if he didn't know why, now I need to come back to Vathari Ossel because her part of the story doesn't end in the transfer corridor either. She filed her after-action report. She submitted the commendation referral for Marcus. She managed the debrief process for her surviving garrison, which is one of those things that looks administrative from the outside and is absolutely harrowing from the inside, sitting with every person who made it out and asking them to put into language what they went through, what they saw, what they lost. She did all of that. And then she requested a formal meeting with Marcus Dallin, which happened in a conference room at Orville Prime on the 9th day after Kellrath, and which I was not present for. I know what was said in that meeting from Vathari herself, whom I interviewed extensively in the months that followed. She told me she had prepared for that meeting, that she'd thought about what she needed to say and how to say it, that she'd gone in with a very clear sense of what the conversation was going to be, an acknowledgement, a thank you, and an explanation of why the order she'd given had been the right one, and why it was important that he understand that even given the outcome. She told me that the meeting was not that conversation. She'd walked in and Marcus had stood up from his chair. Humans do this. She'd observed it at formal functions. It's a mark of respect. And she'd told him to sit down, and he'd sat. And she'd looked at him and realized that she'd had the conversation already internally, 100 times over the 9 days since Kellrath, and he'd already, in the 1,000 iterations she'd run in her own head, already said the thing she needed to hear, which was, I know you were right. I know the order was right. I went anyway, and she'd realized, sitting across from him in that conference room, that she wasn't angry about it anymore. that she wasn't sure she'd ever been angry exactly, that what she'd felt on the operations floor when she'd heard his voice say, "I'll handle Bay 14, was something more complicated than anger. Something that combined fury and relief, and a specific kind of grief, and something she still doesn't have a clean word for in any language she speaks. She'd thought on the operations floor, in the moment after his channel went quiet, if he dies in there, it's my fault. I gave the order that left Thessara in Bay 14. I gave the order that put her outside the safe corridor. If a man dies trying to fix the gap in my plan, she'd thought, that's on me. But she hadn't changed the order, because the order had been right and the math hadn't changed, and you don't bend the math because of guilt. You hold the line. You make the call. You carry the weight of it afterward. She'd held the line and held the open channel to his calm, and listened to the static of his silence, and told herself that the probability of survival was low, and prepared herself for a channel to go quiet forever. And then he'd come back on with Thessara's voice audible in the background, and she told me, gripped the console edge hard enough that the V3 plating on her palm left a mark in the metal. She didn't tell Marcus any of this in the conference room. What she said was, "I want to understand something about you," and Marcus had said, "All right. You're a Terran compact liaison, logistics coordination. You have been on Kellrath station for 6 weeks. In that 6 weeks, you apparently memorized the entirety of the maintenance infrastructure of a mid-tier logistics installation that most of the garrison who'd been there for years hadn't fully mapped. I like to know the layout of spaces I'm in," Marcus said. "It's a habit." Why? He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I grew up in a bad neighborhood on a planet Earth, where knowing the exits and the routes and the back ways was sometimes the difference between walking home and not walking home. I never stopped doing it." A pause. "It's just, I always want to know the layout, every space I'm in. I want to know where the walls are and where the ways through are and what I'd do if I needed to move fast. I don't plan to need it. I just want to know." Vathari looked at him. She stopped. "It's a very human thing," he said, "or a very me thing, I'm not sure which. It saved her life, the layout," he said, "and the pry bar." She looked at him for a long moment. "I filed the commendation referral," she said. "Your people will process it, I heard, thank you. I also wrote you a personal letter," she said, "separate from the official record. You don't have to read it." He looked at her. "I'll read it," she nodded. She told me later that the letter was not easy to write, that she'd started it 4 times and thrown away the first 3 starts because they'd sounded like an official document, or like an apology, or like something she'd rehearsed, and what she wanted it to sound like was true. She wanted it to sound like the thing she'd actually felt standing in the transfer corridor, watching him come through that hatch with Thessara Ven. What she'd written, finally, was short. She wouldn't give me the exact words that was between the two of them, but she told me the shape of it. She'd told him that she had given the correct order. She'd told him that she understood why he hadn't followed it, and that she wasn't sure she would have wanted him to, in her deepest, most honest self, even while she knew she had to give it. She'd told him that watching him come through that hatch had been the moment in 12 years of command that had most completely recalibrated what she understood about what soldiers were for. She'd told him that she didn't know what the Terran Compact was going to mean for the Conclave in the long run, but that she was going to spend whatever influence she had making sure it was given the room it needed to mean something. She told him in the letter that she was glad he was the kind of person who learned the layout of every room he was in. Marcus Dallin read the letter. He kept it. I know this because, 2 years later, I ran into him at a joint operations briefing on Kellrath Station, and I asked him about it. "Still have it," he said. "I don't have a lot of paper things from that period." I have that. Part 3. The Galaxy takes note the story of Kellrath went through several phases in terms of how it was understood. In the first phase, the immediate aftermath, it was primarily a military story. The fall of a key installation, the heroic fighting withdrawal, the speed of the Conclave's counter-response. Vathari Ossel's decisions were analyzed in tactical journals. The Volkai's use of the debris field for approach was studied extensively, and led to a complete overhaul of how sensor networks were distributed around asteroid belts in contested space. Marcus Dallin barely appeared in this first phase. He was a footnote, a detail. Additionally, the following personnel performed noteworthy actions, line in the longer narrative. The second phase happened about 6 months later, when the internal sensor footage from Bay 14 and the adjacent corridors was declassified and released as part of a broader conclave transparency initiative about the Kellrath operation. The footage was grainy, partial, and covered by static interference from the blast damage, but it was enough. Enough to see him moving through the maintenance shaft, enough to see him at the cockpit canopy. Enough to see, in one terrible clear moment before a sensor malfunction interrupted the feed, the moment the strut shifted wrong and Marcus threw his whole body weight against the pry bar and held it. Enough. The second phase was different from the first. The second phase was the galactic public trying to process something it didn't have good language for yet. The Conclave's member species had their own traditions of heroism, of sacrifice, of the individual action against impossible odds. Every culture has those traditions. Every species with enough history has the stories of the one who went when no one else did. But humans were new. And humans, the broader galaxy was discovering, had something. Some particular relationship with the gap between impossible and just very hard that didn't look like anything else in the Conclave's catalog. I wrote the long-form account of Kellrath in that second phase. It ran in the Conclave Intelligence Archive's public series, and it was the longest thing I'd ever written, and it was the first time I'd ever felt like the story I was telling was bigger than the space I could put it in. I interviewed 47 people for it. Survivors of the garrison, Voakai, through a diplomatic intermediary with their testimony carefully managed, members of the counteroffensive force, logistics personnel, medical staff from Orville Prime. I interviewed Vathari Ossel 3 times. She was thorough, careful, and honest in a way that military commanders often aren't when they're talking about events that are being archived. I interviewed Thessara Ven twice. She was flying again by the time of the second interview, in a new fighter, and she spoke about Marcus the way you speak about something you've absorbed into yourself, not as an external event that happened to you, but as a thing that changed the shape of you from the inside. I don't know if I'm a different pilot because of it, she said. I don't know if the experience changed my flying or my decisions in the cockpit. I think about it sometimes, whether it made me more careful or less careful or something else entirely. A pause. What I know is that when I'm in a tight situation, when the math looks bad and the options look narrow, I hear him, in my head, saying it's hard. There's a difference between hard and impossible. What are the paths? What can you reach? She was quiet for a moment. Is that strange, that a human's voice is the thing I hear? No, I said. I don't think it's strange at all. I interviewed Marcus himself 4 times over the course of the piece. He was consistently the most reluctant of my interview subjects, not unforthcoming exactly, but careful about the way he put things, and resistant to any framing that made him the center of the story. Thessara made it back because she kept fighting in that cockpit, he said, in the third interview. She could have the med system was giving her enough that she could have gone somewhere else inside herself, somewhere less painful. She didn't. She stayed present. She answered my questions. She pushed when I said push. She did the work. A pause. I figured out the paths. She walked them. Without you, there were no paths, I said. Without her, there was nothing to do the paths for, he said. That matters. It matters a lot. You don't do the math for an abstract. You do it for a person. The person is what makes the math worth doing. Here is the thing that struck me, working on that piece. I talked to a lot of Conclave species about Marcus, about the rescue, about what it meant to them. And there was a pattern in the responses that I didn't fully understand until I was well into the writing process. Most of the responses were versions of we understand the action. We do not fully understand the motivation. Not that it was incomprehensible. People could follow the logic, could map it as self-sacrifice in service of in-group bonding, could categorize it under known behavioral patterns. But there was something at the edges of the understanding that didn't quite close. something that remained slightly outside the frame. It was a V3 psychologist, not affiliated with the Kellrath operation, just someone I consulted during the reporting, who said something that stuck with me. "The difficulty," she said, "is that most conclave species make the calculation. Even the most altruistic ones, even the ones with the deepest in-group loyalty, make some version of the survival probability calculation before committing to an action of that risk. The calculation is very fast, often unconscious, but it happens. It shapes the decision. It's rational in the specific sense of rational that means producing outputs the individual can survive to benefit from." A pause. What is strange about humans, and I want to be careful here, because this is a generalization based on limited data, is that the calculation appears to be secondary. It appears to happen after a more fundamental decision that is something like this person is a person and people are what I am for. And then the calculation is about how, not whether. He thought about that a lot. Whether it's accurate, whether it generalizes, whether the psychology is as clean as she described. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but I know that when I watched Marcus Dallin on that operations floor in the seconds before everything started screaming, the way he looked at the tactical display, the way he said they're coming all the way in, the way he set down his ration pack, there was something in his face that I have been trying to name ever since. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't fear. It wasn't calculation. It was something that looked, in retrospect, a lot like readiness, like someone who had been, in some sense, waiting, not for a battle, not for a crisis specifically, but for the moment when they would need to be what they actually were. And who, when the moment arrived, was simply there. Let me tell you about something that happened 6 months after the Kellrath piece was published. I was in a diplomatic reception on Kellrath Station. The kind of event I normally tried to avoid. Too many species and too much formal register, and too much of the kind of conversation that sounds like it contains information but doesn't. But I'd been told that Commander Vathari Ossel was going to be there, and I had a follow-up question for a piece I was working on, so I went. The reception was in one of Kellrath's atmospheric garden halls, a large, domed space with cultivated plant life from about 30 different member worlds, which creates an extraordinary sensory environment that simultaneously smells like about 20 different kinds of home for 20 different species. It's disorienting and beautiful. I found Vathari near a cluster of something that smelled like the V3 home world. I'd smelled it at their delegation office, a specific combination of minerals and biological matter that apparently triggers very specific neurochemical responses in V3. She was standing with 2 other people, and when I got close enough to see them clearly, I stopped. One of them was Marcus Dallin. The other was Thessara Venn. I don't know why I was surprised. It made complete sense that they'd all be in the same place. Vathari was now a senior tactical advisor with broad conclave responsibilities. Thessara had been promoted and was in the conclave joint operations wing, and Marcus had been, formally, ceremonially, and with a great deal of documentation, transferred out of logistics and into a new cross-species coordination unit that was, in many ways, a direct consequence of Kellrath. It made complete sense. And yet seeing the 3 of them together, standing in a diplomatic reception with drinks they were barely touching, talking with the ease of people who had been through something together, and had the specific intimacy that produces, it stopped me.